Good morning. Nice to see you here this morning, and let me add my welcome to John's. If you're a visitor here, really good to see you amongst us. We hope you feel very comfortable here. Keep your Bibles open, please, to Luke 21. Living in the light of judgment. Last time out, we heard about how Jesus exposed the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem as frauds who didn't understand the scriptures. They didn't get what the law was about. They didn't get who the Messiah was, and so they didn't get that glory, true glory, is seen in sacrificial service. The supposed glory of the scribes and Pharisees and religious experts was far outweighed by the actual glory of the humble sacrifice of that widow. They wanted the respect and support of man, but she had the respect and support of God. For Jesus condemns them, but commends her. Now, this problem of misunderstanding the scriptures and what the Messiah came to do, and all that meant for the established religious setup of the day, is a theme which is continuing to run through the section we're studying this morning. This section is just a continuation of that very same day and teaching. And so we must realize that its context is going to be vitally important for us as we read through chapter 21. And the continuation and context is something we see straight away there in verse 5 with that and while some were speaking of the temple, how it was adorned with noble stones and offerings. Jesus said. Now we know from the parallel passage in Matthew, we know that they're just on their way out of the temple when they see the widow leaving her offering. They're coming down from the Temple Mount. They go down the hill. They go across the valley, up the other side to the Mount of Olives. And you can imagine them sitting there on the Mount of Olives looking over the temple complex when this discourse takes place. And so one of the disciples opens up and looking across at the temple there says, "Wow, look at the glory of our temple. Look at the external adornments of it. What a fine building it is." And notice the noble offerings there. Very impressive, important offerings. And you're like, did you just hear what Jesus was saying on the way down from the temple? You know, all that stuff about the so-called impressive offerings of the rich in verse 4 and the external adornments of the scribes and Pharisees and the person and work and who the Messiah is at the end of chapter 20. Did you just miss that, what he just said there? It's a strange thing. And Jesus' response to that comment is dramatic. All this you see here that you're so impressed with, verse 6, the days will come when there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. It's all going to burn. It's all going to go. And this isn't just like an architectural tragedy that Jesus prophesies here. You know, the cultural artifact is destroyed, and that's nationally disappointing. Like if the Eiffel Tower fell over or the Houses of Parliament blew up or something. The disciples would have known that this language of the temple being destroyed means so much more than that. Because, of course, it had happened once before in the history of Israel. On that previous occasion, the people had thoroughly rejected the living God. And eventually the Lord brings his judgment that he prophesied against them. And in 586 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar II comes and captures Jerusalem for the Babylonians. And he destroys the temple that was built by King Solomon. And he carts the people off into slavery, and they're scattered. And here, now, Jesus is talking in the same terms, isn't he? This is going to go. The implication is very strong that this also means that you have rejected God and his Messiah, and judgment is coming against you, and you will be cast out. That's the depth of what is behind what Jesus says here. And if we've been reading Luke all the way through, this sounds very familiar. It sounds very consistent with what Jesus has been speaking about this very day. already. Luke 19, for example, from verse 41. It says, when he drew near the city, Jesus drew near Jerusalem, he wept over it, saying, would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace. But now they're hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade round you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you. And they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation. And in the parable of the tenants that Jesus has also said very recently in chapter 20, the people were saying, let's kill the son. Let's take the inheritance for ourselves. And what's God's response to that? Well, the parable says in verse 18, he will come and kill those wicked tenants. The tenants wanted earthly glory, wealth, and recognition. And they rejected the prophets who had come to them. They rejected the scriptures, and ultimately they reject the Son, the Messiah, and his work. So God will bring his judgment for the people's rejection of Jesus. That is the context here. The temple, this that you see here, all these offerings, I'm going to destroy them, Jesus says. It's going to go. Now, before we look at the question, which is kind of understandable, logical question that the disciples would ask in verse 7, like, when's this going to happen? We need to step back and acknowledge that what Jesus says there, that the temple is going to be destroyed, it makes sense of the scriptures. It's logically the right thing to do. We ought not to be surprised theologically, knowing what we know, that the temple ought to be destroyed shortly after Jesus enters into heaven. Now, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, as we've seen throughout chapter 20, they didn't really get the scriptures, who the Messiah was and what he came to do. They didn't really understand the law, the prophets. They didn't understand the sacrificial system, the priesthood, the meeting place, the temple itself, because they didn't follow it through to the Messiah, which is what all of these things pointed to. So once the Messiah has come and he completes his work, well, the temple has served its purpose, hasn't it? Obviously, it becomes obsolete, as the writer to the Hebrews says in chapter 8 and verse 13. The temple was a type and shadow of Christ, and now that the substance and reality is here, there is no need for the shadow. Christ himself, in his body, is the true temple. As John chapter 1 says, the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. Jesus of Nazareth, the God-man, is the meeting place par excellence between God and man in his hypostatic union. All divine, all human. There it is, the meeting place. Jesus Christ, in whom, Ephesians 2 says, the whole structure being joined together grows into a holy temple in the Lord. In him, you, in Ephesus, are also being built together into a dwelling place for God by the Spirit. Jesus, the head and cornerstone. The church, his body, the church, the Spirit-filled temple of the Lord. The fulfillment of all that the old covenant was pointing to. So we ought not to be too surprised that Jesus says the temple will be destroyed. It makes sense, doesn't it? Its purpose has been served. In fact, if you think about it more deeply, we have to say the temple really has to go. Because to keep the old temple system and all of the religion around that, or to want to go back to it, would undermine the incarnation of Christ, God and man meeting in hypostatic union in the person Jesus of Nazareth. And you ruin the doctrine of the church, the temple of the Holy Spirit. Furthermore, Jesus Christ is high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, and so the old Levitical priesthood needs to be cast aside, Hebrews 7 says. So to want to re-establish it or to keep it would be to reject the eternal priesthood of Jesus. Furthermore, Hebrews is clear Jesus' sacrifice is once and for all. So to keep the sacrifices in the temple would be to totally destroy the doctrine of the atonement and undermine the work of Christ on the cross. It is finished, is what he says. It is finished. The temple has to go. It is a theological necessity. And for these reasons, there cannot and will not be a third temple. Jesus says, it's all got to go. The old has gone. The new has come. But Jesus' disciples at this point, they're hearing this for the first time. They're piecing this together. We've got the benefit of looking back. They've not got that. Nevertheless, they recognize Jesus' power, they recognize his prophetic ability, and they trust that. So they ask in verse 7, when's this going to happen? They believe that it will. They trust him. So when? What are the telltale signs, Jesus? And at this point, we need to acknowledge that there are debates over how to interpret chapter 21. But hopefully, we're expecting to let context be king. The discourse here does not take place in a vacuum. It all comes off the back of everything we've been looking at in chapters 19 and 20. Part of the reason that there is a little confusion here is because, for example, in verses 25 and 28 through to 28, it kind of sounds like the second coming, doesn't it? Yeah? There's signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, the Son of Man coming on a cloud, the heavens shaking and so on. And in fairness, you can see why in those verses. So some people will say that because of that, the details here around the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem and the abomination of desolation, all of that is to do with the future. It's all yet future, some will say. But to conclude that, you do have to take this small section on its own in isolation of its context, which, as we've seen, is who the Messiah is, what he came to do, and about the fact that Jesus says it's going to be destroyed. The temple's going to go. The old is passing away. The new is coming. Jesus is turning everything right side up. He's fulfilling all that's written about him in the law and the prophets, the things the scribes and the Pharisees didn't understand. It really has to happen. And ultimately, reading in context, we have to look at verse 32. We have to deal with verse 32. Which is perhaps the most convincing reason to not think that it is all only about things in the future, the end of the world. Luke 21, verse 32, Jesus says, truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all has taken place. We've got to take that seriously. It cannot all be future, only to be understood about the end of the world. And of course, many of the events here did actually take place in AD 70, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, when the Romans laid siege to the city surrounding it and putting the siege ramps up against the city walls in exactly the way that Jesus prophesied here. And that all happened in the lifetime of the disciples he was speaking to. However, However, there are parts of this, obviously, which do stretch far beyond AD 70 to that great and final day. So it's not only about 70 either for the disciples. It is now and not yet. That should be a comfort to us, I think. Now and not yet. And it's important that we see that and get that. So much like we've seen in the destruction of the city of Jericho or of Ai, when the Lord visits in judgment, there is so much that is prophetic of the final judgment. And the destruction of Jerusalem here is the same sort of thing. It seems to me this is more about the end of the old covenant and the establishing and the beginning of the new. That is the context, all centered around the life, death, resurrection and ascension of Jesus the Messiah. All that stuff, the law and the prophets, the temple, the priests, the sacrifices, it all points forward to Jesus. And so that means this old shadowy system isn't needed anymore. The reality has come. And for those who have rejected Jesus, and for those who continue today to reject Jesus, there is judgment. The wicked tenants of the vineyard will and need to be punished, and all who reject Christ will be sent to outer darkness. So it is now for the disciples and not yet. Which means for the disciples, Jesus is actually giving them really helpful instructions for how to live in the light of the judgment which will come in their lifetime. The city's going to burn. It's going to suck for you guys. Here's how to deal with that. There are specific instructions. Run to the Judean hills. That's a great place to be safe. That clearly doesn't apply to us. But there is enough here in this to keep us engaged, to keep us listening, because we too must face a final day of vengeance and live in the light of its coming today. So, with that said, the disciples go, well, when's this going to happen, Jesus? This sounds terrible. What's going to happen? And they ask two questions here. When will these things, referring to the temple, when will this happen? They ask a second question, what will be the sign of that day? And if we had longer, we could talk about how that works, but we don't. We'll do that another day. But the first thing that Jesus says to them about living in the light of the judgment, this is the simple stuff now, okay? The first thing Jesus says about living in the light of the judgment to come in verse 8 is do not be deceived. Do not be deceived. There's going to be loads of claims at the end about people saying, I'm the Messiah. Someone will come and say, I'm the Messiah. And this is the end. Don't be deceived, Jesus says. There will be climactic world events, wars and earthquakes and tumults and famines, and there always has been, hasn't there? But verse 9, don't get frightened by these things. These things must take place first, stuff like the destruction of the temple. But the end will not be at once. There it is again. Now and not yet. The destruction of the temple and some crazy stuff. These things, but the end is still to come. It may feel like the end of the world. And whatever we're suffering today, sometimes it might feel like the end of the world. But don't let anyone deceive you. Don't let anyone deceive you. This was true in the first century, not least with Vespasian, who did actually claim in AD 70 he was the Messiah, and he sends his son Titus and Jerusalem is destroyed. But it's also true today. There are stories that go around even today in the 21st century of deluded people saying, I'm the Messiah. There's certainly loads of people claiming to read world events and say that this is it, this is the time. And again, if you read church history, it's ever been thus since the beginning. Sell your house. Don't bother paying taxes, guys, because the end's coming next week. So postpone the wedding. Save your money. It's happened over and over again. But don't you be deceived. Don't be deceived. What helpful advice from Jesus. Secondly, he says, be ready for persecution. Be ready for persecution. Verse 12, before all this, earthquakes, famines, wars, various places, before all this, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you to the synagogues and prisons. And you will be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. This will be your opportunity to bear witness. And all you have to do is read the book of Acts to see these words being fulfilled. Various times the 12 were handed over to synagogues and stood before kings, and they were given wisdom beyond themselves so that no one could contradict them. There was betrayal, there was martyrdom, and it did happen before this generation passed away. That was true then in the first century, but its principle continues today in the 21st century, doesn't it? The intensity of persecution will vary and fluctuate from place to place and time to time, but we will face persecution. We must be ready. Clearly, it doesn't mean that we will all have to bear witness before kings. It's not a one-to-one thing here, but the principle is still true today, that we must be ready for persecution. There will be martyrs. There will be betrayals, right until that last day when Jesus comes in final judgment. And notice how realistic he is here in verse 17. If you're a follower of Jesus, you will be hated by everyone. You'll be misunderstood, and we are. You'll be despised and marginalized, and we are, even in this country. Now, when Jesus says not a hair on your head will perish, he doesn't mean you won't get hurt. Because, of course, he said already that some of the disciples will be put to death. We have to read this in the light of verse 19. In standing firm for Jesus, it may well be that you die. It may cost you your life. But in that loyalty to him, don't you gain your life also? A man called Justin, in the 2nd century, a martyr, Justin Martyr, he got this. He said, you can kill us, but you can't do any real harm to us. You can kill us, but you can't do us any real harm. Be ready for persecution. Thirdly, there are specific signs here to do with Jerusalem in verse 20. The sign for you guys when you see the city being surrounded by armies. We had this also in chapter 19. When you see them coming and surrounding you and putting up their siege ramps against the walls, run to the hills. Rather than running into the city and staying there, which would be the instinct, wouldn't it? Because Jerusalem was fantastically secure and well protected. No, you guys, you've got to get out of Dodge. You've got to escape the punishment that is coming. Matthew adds as well that when you see another sign, the most disgusting thing you've ever seen taking place in the temple, that's a sign for you. Run, flee. When you see the most abominable act ever, run away. And that's what they did. When an army of Jewish zealots were trying to keep control of the city in their battle against the Romans, they actually used the temple as a stronghold. They held up in the temple and even slaughtered some of the priests. It's a disgusting thing. And interestingly, history records that at that very time, guess who left town? The Christians! The reader certainly did hear and understand. Now, I think up to verse 24, clearly there's a whole bunch of stuff there about the destruction and fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. But from verse 25, we do get this slight change. We get this apocalyptic sounding language, which, as we've seen, could throw us off course a little bit. Now, remember, we've said that some Christians can take this passage to mean it's only referring to AD 70, nothing else. And some Christians say that it's only referring to the end of the world and nothing else. And I'm saying it refers to both. Primarily, yes, to AD 70, but in the sense that it pictures for us final judgment and has instruction for us. The primary outworking has been seen, but the principles continue as we wait for resurrection morning. So I think we should carry on reading here as we have been. There must be some way in which verses 25 to 28 also take place in the lifetime of the disciples. But at the same time, there's a sense in which it stretches forward and continues for us today as we wait for final judgment. And the big question is, well, how does that work then, Rich? Well, it's not as complicated as it may seem to answer. A careful reading of Daniel 7 will sort us out. When we read Daniel 7, where the language in the passage here comes from, we read that it refers principally to the ascension of Jesus Christ, his exaltation, something that the disciples definitely witnessed. But then in Daniel 7, it does open up and it widens it out in an idealistic sense to include all nations worshipping Jesus in the everlasting kingdom. Daniel 7 from verse 13, it says this, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So in Daniel, the Son of Man travels on the clouds of heaven into the presence of God the Father, not actually to the earth, that's clear. He goes into his Father, and he is given power and authority, and he's enthroned, he's exalted forever and ever. But, as we've been seeing in our Revelation studies, the language of Jesus riding the clouds of heaven is also used to speak of his return. The Son of Man on the clouds of heaven always, therefore, seems to refer in some way to the cosmic and exalted Christ ruling unstoppably over all creation. Whether it is in the inauguration of the new covenant as he ascends, or as that time is closed when he returns. The reading fits with this, and with that wider context that we began with. The old covenant is on its way out. The new covenant is on its way in. The temple has to go. The Messiah has come, and he's fulfilling those ancient shadows. In his serving, like with the widow, the Messiah is glorified, which the scribes just don't understand. They didn't understand the scriptures about the Messiah like Psalm 110. In his stooping, in his serving, in his suffering, Jesus is glorified. That's true glory. That's divine glory. And as Paul says in Philippians 2, that because of this, therefore, for this reason, because of the crib, because of the cross, the Father gives him the crown, and he is given that exalted place, the name above every name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow. He is exalted. And so the disciples witness the inauguration in his ascension. He is exalted, and it will be complete in his return. This is the now and the not yet of the kingdom of God that we see right through the scriptures. The last days from his ascension to his return. These are the days we're living in. These are the days the disciples witnessed to. So, let's press on. Let's press on with the application. Either way, maybe you don't take it this way if you read it, but the application remains the same. Hopefully we can still track together on this. How should we live as we wait for judgment? How should we live? Well, we've seen already that Jesus says, don't be deceived. Don't be deceived. Be ready for persecution. But now he tells us, be careful of distractions. Be careful of distractions. Verse 34. Watch yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down. It's very tender. It's very pastoral advice now. Jesus knows us well. He knows how easily distracted and led astray we can be. And we can wander into the day of judgment like an animal wanders into a trap following its stomach. He says it's possible to be caught out on Judgment Day, being so distracted with all the other things of life, we just blindly walk into it. Whether that is the disciples waiting for that siege, or us waiting for the return of Christ, distractions will weigh down our hearts. Notice he's speaking about the heart here. How could that happen? Jesus says our hearts can be weighed down and overtaken with other stuff. And he says by dissipation. Now that's not a word we use very much today. It just means indulgence. It means giving ourselves comforts and whatever takes our fancy. It's serving self. It's being absorbed with the things that are around us. We can see how that would take our hearts away from Jesus, who is our true hope, Jesus, who is our true inheritance. And that dissipation goes together with the next word, which is drunkenness. And it's an example of that dissipation, indulgence. Now, drunkenness in the Bible refers to more than just drinking too much. Obviously, it refers at very least to that. But it also is used to refer to a state of mind which is completely oblivious to reality. And that could come from a number of different things. Perfectly good things, even. We could be so taken up by something in our lives that we're not thinking sober thoughts. We're so distracted by the fact that we disagree with Rich on how we read this chapter that we can't hear anything right now. Seriously. Are you being distracted in your mind? Is it pulling your heart away from your true hope, which is Jesus? Let me ask you, which of these things distracts you? pleasure or anxiety or both? Most of us fall into one of those two categories. We take our eyes off the ball one way or the other because we're indulging ourselves or we're so caught up with something, whether it's the daily anxieties of looking after the kids or stressful work or things that are going on with our health, that we're not thinking sober thoughts about Jesus, that he is coming to issue judgment, that the gospel is our focus and motivation, that we must be on mission every day of our lives. We're distracted by pleasure or by anxiety or by both. Which one is you? We need to know that. Be careful of distractions in these last days. And Jesus' final command here is very similar to that. I'm just bunching them together about distraction. Keep looking ahead, verse 36. Keep looking ahead. Stay awake at all times. Now, this isn't possible to read if you're a literalist, you know. Never go to bed. Ever. No, it doesn't mean that. It means being expectant. And how do we remain expectant and ready? Well, it goes together with prayer. Prayer's not actually a second command here. It's connected to the watching. Always be watching. Always be prayerful that you may escape. Because if you know that judgment is coming, you've got to pray to the Lord that you may escape it. Your kingdom come. Your will be done. Oh Lord, deliver us from evil. Whether you're a disciple in the first century or you're a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. We need to be praying and watching. Our daily prayers should have that eternal perspective, that edge driven by heaven and hell. Just as the disciples should have had that edge, we are watching for these things. We're ready for the Romans, ready to run to the hills. God is going to exalt his Son, Jesus. He is. That's where the world is heading. However you chop that up, that's true. Jesus came to the earth, he was rejected, and God will punish all who reject Jesus Christ. That day will come when everybody will stand before the Son of Man. Everyone will stand before him. Each disciple sitting there among the ancient olive trees, looking across at the temple. They will face the Son of Man. Each learner, each follower of Jesus here this morning, you will face the Son of Man. Each person out there who does not know, walking past oblivious, they will face the Son of Man one day. We need to be watchful. We need to be prayerful. May I escape the judgment. May I stand before the Son. May I not be led astray, deceived. May I not take my eyes off the ball. May I be ready. May I be ready to serve. May I give glory to Jesus through sacrificial service. May I truly understand these scriptures until that day that I am called before the Son of Man. Watch and pray, friends. Watch and pray. Are you ready? Are you living in the light of judgment? It is coming. Be careful of deceivers. Be ready for persecution. Be careful of distraction. And keep looking ahead. Keep eternity in mind, and that will focus you away from your pleasures, your stresses and anxieties, and keep you fixed and focused on Jesus, your true and only hope.